Um, Good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to introduce Francis Convery RSA this evening to talk about his work and his current exhibition, Hindsight, which is on view in the Academicians Gallery at the RSA. Frank was born in Paisley and studied at Edinburgh College of Art before joining the faculty at the college in the mid-80s. Frank then went on to teach at Grey School of Art, Aberdeen for many years, where he was really influential over younger generations as British artists. Frank has been the recipient of numerous awards. He became Associate of the RSA in 1994, and he became a full academician in 2005. Frank is now based in Angus and has very recently moved to Montrose. And as we'll see, his work is really the product of living and working in this rural Scottish environment. And we're going to look at some images of the exhibition. I think, Frank, we're going to start by talking a bit about your childhood, your upbringing, and how you came to study art at Edinburgh College of Art.
Artists became artists, and what was the route? And it seemed that my own route was maybe unusual, but certainly it was different in our family. The guy in the middle at the front is my great-grandfather, and immediately at the very back row is my grandfather. And these guys are shipbuilders, and my own dad is a shipbuilder. And so there was a real tradition for all the males in the family to go into engineering of some sort. And I had 4 brothers who all did something similar. So as the youngest, I had gone into engineering. And I think there's another picture coming up, which has me under a 150-ton boiler as an 18-year-old, when I should have been at art school. But the idea being that in this process, it became clear to me that this was not the career for me and that I needed to go to art school. Now, it wasn't a flit of fancy. I had always done well in school and in competitions, and in fact had won many awards as a schoolboy, but never really saw the option of being an artist and doing that for a living. So it was a case of, seeing out my apprenticeship. And of course, my mother always said, well, you can always go back if it doesn't work out, which was reassuring. So what's the next picture we have?
So you enrolled.
So yes, this is 1978, and of course I have to put a portfolio together. So I go to Glasgow School of Art, and it's just a precursor to what happened. I went through to Edinburgh, not for any specific reason, but simply to move away from all the friends and acquaintances which I had become more comfortable with on the West Coast, and to do something that was going to be challenging. And I didn't really know what Edinburgh had to offer other than, an exciting city. But I didn't at that stage know a great deal about the teaching faculty. So the next image will be me as a student. It's somewhat ironic that I'm in the forest and the woods, which has become very much a feature of the work that I've made over the last 40 years. I'm a serious student. One of the benefits of having been in an engineering environment is that you've got a kind of work ethic that's fairly well developed, and you use the time well. I mean, I was a couple of years older than a lot of my contemporaries, but it seemed to me that was an edge that I had, and I should use it. And the next image is possibly me at art school, taking something of my social conscience with me, having come through the kind of union side of engineering. It was certainly something I was quite pleased to be involved in student politics, which were pretty exciting at that time in the late 70s, early 80s. So I'm thinking what the next image will be. This is me, a self-portrait, conceited self-portrait, but the academic exacting nature of what Edinburgh offered was really what I needed. I was looking to do as much as possible, to learn as much as possible and put the work in. So the whole academic side was something that I was very keen to consider as important, not knowing at that stage what I was going to do with it. And I think that the other image that we might see is beginning to suggest that other things are interesting to me. The screen behind me here as a second year student is where all the students used to wipe their brushes and their palettes, and it seemed to me to be, you know, a very interesting option in terms of what was happening or what I was learning about in terms of abstract expressionism and so on, and different options in painting other than realism. So there was quite early on, there was this interest both in the exacting academic elements and the more abstracted and expressive elements. And they seem to have been, for me anyway, very useful foils for one another. So the next image, this is a John Bellamy image, which amongst many, I had become increasingly interested in what was happening in Scotland, and especially if there was an Edinburgh connection. And John Bellamy had come to the art school on a couple of occasions when I was a student to tour. And he and I mean, we met twice, I think, in that time, and immediately got on pretty well. There seemed to be a kindred spirit, not so much in the bevy, because John was at the height of his drink then, but the idea that we were both interested in the same things and the exacting nature of academic training and what you might be able to do with it. And it was one of the occasions, it was when he spoke to me about this, what he called the ability to improvise and to extemporize, and which I didn't really understand at the time, but he referenced Alan Davey, and he was someone that John Bellamy had been influenced by as well. And it's because of this ability, when you've got skills and talents, to use them in whatever way that you wish. And that allows you to improvise and extemporize. So this idea of what's the relevance of the academic training, it seemed to me to be very clear then that it gave you this kind of the virtuoso possible, what can I do today? I'll do whatever I like attitude, which, as I say, is slightly conceited, but it was exactly what I needed. I needed to be armed with all the kit to make paintings that would come into my head, because I had no idea what I wanted to paint, but I was quite sure that they would offer themselves, that they'd be conjured up in the studio. And this is quite early, this is in the early 80s. So the whole idea of hindsight is that things haven't really changed for me over this long period. When I look back, these things seem to have some connection. There's a conflation of various things which has gone on. And it's when I look back, I see them for having a meaningful connection, where at the time I really was in the middle of it and couldn't really make that connection. So this cycle has continued over the 40 years since I left art school. So this is an image, this is one of my images from the mid-80s. And you can see it was influenced by a much more expressive and gestural kind of figuration. Hockney, Kitai, Alan Davey. I mean, there's lots of people that I had been looking at that were working at the time, and it seemed quite exciting. And clearly I was, you know, I was part of that new figuration that was coming through. as a kind of a foil to the more abstract work, which was predominant in the 70s. So if we move on to the next image, it's another image that's in Belford Road at the National Gallery. It's a Kitai, if not, which I remember seeing and being absolutely knocked out by, because it had brought many of the elements which interested me: the landscape, the collaged imagery, the drawing, the detail, the subtext, lots of layers of things going on, which intrigued me, made me want to go back and look at it again. And this was a painting 10 years later, which clearly had been influenced by this process and this idea of collaging images and them having a subtext to them. And this was the staff at Gray's School of Art, because I had moved up to Aberdeen in 1988. And this was, you'll see Joyce Cairns down at the bottom, and Gordon Bryce to the left, Sandy Fraser, Robbie Bush, Joe Fan to the left, and so on. So the staff and the students were all being brought together in this painting. And it wasn't, I'm on the right-hand side, exiting the frame, as it were. Now, that wasn't a precursor to me leaving. It was just a compositional ploy to have me slightly detached from the flow that was going to the left. So in the next image, I think I'm just going to tail off now the idea of the Edinburgh School and still lifes and landscapes was very strong. Gillis, Mickey Phillips.
You went to New York, didn't you, Frank? And you went to New York.
Yes, that was in the early 80s when I went to New York. I'm not sure, this is maybe more relevant than the sequence. When I went to New York in the early 80s, it was full of the vigorous kind of figuration that had re-emerged, the Baselitz, and our own Stephen Campbell was over there, who I went to visit and spent some time with, which was eventful. But one of the really memorable occasions was going to the Met and seeing this Bastien Lepage painting, which I couldn't recall ever seeing an image of. But Bastien Lepage, for many of you, you'll probably know in the National Gallery, they've got a great example of his. It's a boy with a fishing rod standing, I think it's Nothing Doing, it's called. And it's a wonderful piece of realism, but it's got a lot more to it. And so they come back to this Bastien Lepage. This caught me unawares because it had so many different elements to it in terms of the realism and the academic accuracy, but it went far beyond that in terms of the composition and the subtext to it. So these things about realism and subtext kept recurring. The action of painting, the evidence of painting seemed very important to me. So that I wasn't interested in photorealism. You had to see how it had been made. And that was a distinction, because also photorealism was something that was quite important and big in the 70s and 80s. So I was kind of rejecting that, and then seeing this confirmed to me that you could have realism in the work, but it really shouldn't be about reality. It should be about some magical changed view, possibly one which you've reflected and invented. And that again is something that's consistently been the way I've worked in the studio. We got another image. Yeah, I suppose we've all got favorites in terms of paintings, and this Roger van der Weyden painting, which is the Descent of Christ on the Cross, I had seen in reproduction, but when I saw it in the Prado, I think it was 1983, when I had just graduated and was doing a tour, and it just knocked me out. And again, it had this element of realism in it, but the compositional elements in it, the color, the tone, all of these things had been valued and considered and altered and changed clearly in the most difficult circumstances. And I can just remember the tears welling up, not so much for the emotion of what was being depicted, but the wonder at how this had been achieved and at the time. So there are certain paintings that have stayed with me, and they've rewarded me by going back to them and reminding myself of the values and the things that I think are important in painting, and hopefully bring them to my own work, and possibly in a more modest way, but nevertheless have the same aspiration to them.
It's brilliant to hear, about those influences that I guess our audience will, some of those influences they will have been able to read into your work, and others are more kind of surprising. So it's a really brilliant introduction to your kind of the thought process built up to your practice as it is now. And this is an earlier painting, isn't it, Frank? But it has many of the same themes that we're seeing in the body of work, I guess, that makes up your current show.
Yes, I'm sorry for this long-winded intro, but it seemed to me to be useful to try and put this in context. But this is a flood, and increasingly I was allowing things which were happening around me to influence the decisions that I made in the studio. And it was never a case of going into the studio with an image which I had recorded. It was much more going into the studio with an idea and playing around, literally playing around with materials until something happened. And again, this would be one of maybe 5 or 6 paintings that would be going on at the same time. And when you got kind of stuck or unsure of when you could move to another and become less precious and work through some problem and then come back to that one in a different mood. And this proved to be the method which again has sustained me, is working on several paintings at the one time with an idea. And that idea can be stretched in different ways. And it didn't, for it to be complete or to be resolved, only reveals itself as the painting progresses. And some are fairly quick in as much as they can be a couple of weeks, but others I've had for 5, 6 years that still get revisited. And I've made some improvements on them over the years, but they still aren't finished, and I wouldn't exhibit them as yet.
In this one, we can see those really strong compositional devices that are really evident in the work in your current show. I guess this one's kind of, it's a little bit more subtle, but those kind of diagonal lines really draw you into the picture plane and make it very clear that you're looking at, a landscape, and there's a real sense of deluge in it.
Yeah.
Themes which are very kind of biblical, which is something that we discussed before. This weird situation that we're in, the pandemic being like a plague, and the floods, which are themes picked up in your current show. And this is, Frank, this is your this is the
RSA diploma work. Yeah,
exactly. And just so everybody knows, a diploma work is the work that an artist gives to the RSA when they are elected an academician. And it's a really strong vertical work with 2 panels, and often you work in multiple panels, don't you, Frank? Is there something that that appeals to you about working across multiple canvases at once?
Yes, I think both. I was saying that the working method I have is to work on related paintings, 4 or 5, and it's not unusual for me to look at them together. And quite often they become diptychs or triptychs, not because I had that intended, but because as they've developed, they kind of borrow something from one another and then end up, being a pair or a triptych. This was a Grasset Gibbon period. I had moved to the Mearns, and I was thinking very much about the Scotch Quair and Sunset Song. And so this image here was part of that. It was not literary, but me reading about where I was now living, and in the studio conjuring up some of the images that seemed to me to relate to the books. And it was very much at the time, 94, I think. I'm not sure when I painted this. It would be the mid to late 90s. That there was I wouldn't say a change, but a kind of maturing confidence about the kind of way that I would work. I think that happens for artists. I think that it's not that they get comfortable, but their instincts tell them that this is the way to go. So by working in panels, it seemed to suit both the imagery that I was hoping to achieve and the presentation when they were exhibited. So I was usually, in relative terms, satisfied when I had exhibited these pieces.
And one of the things that I think is really fascinating about your work is how, no matter how abstract it becomes, often you revert to figure. And I guess that's really evident in this one. You have a really strong abstract ground, but then there's this very figurative position right in the middle of it. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about that balance and how you find it between figuration and abstraction.
Well, it's the abstract nature of design and composition that interests me. It always has done. I mean, going back to the other, some of the other paintings that I had admired, they had, some kind of compositional device and geometry going on in them that drew you in. And I think that, I naturally unpick things. Why am I drawn to this? And it seemed to me to be important to have a very interesting composition in order to bring some subject matter out. The opposite didn't interest me. Just for it all to be about the central image wasn't enough. I needed more than that. So thinking in the Van der Weyden, as an example, you look from left to right, from top to bottom, there's interest everywhere. So this compositional balance, this constantly refining and adjusting from left to right, from top to bottom, is something that I'd always needed to do. I couldn't leave it alone until it seemed to me to be resolved. And I take the point that, this again, I think there were 5 pieces in this theme, as it were, where there was Southern influence and there was an American influence and there was a Russian influence. And it was simply that I was looking at artworks which were conjuring up influences for me. And I have no issue or problem with that. I think, we all are influenced by the experiences that we have. And it seemed to me odd that you wouldn't display these influences. It seems crazy in my mind. So whatever's happening in my life, emotionally, or in fact, in terms of art that I'm seeing and enjoying, it will have an impact. And I think it should manifest itself in the work.
And to talk a bit further about your painting process, so this is a lovely photograph of what was your studio, which is an amazing space, obviously. I'm sure everybody would be interested to hear, when you start off with a canvas, what basis are you starting on? Are you working from any source material? Is it all kind of recalled imagery? Do you work on photographs? What's the process at the very sort of first stages?
No photographs, no drawings. It's a case of coming in with an idea, and quite often It'll be a compositional idea that I'll decide that I need to have a painting which is going to have strong color and contrast in it. So I'll make first marks without looking at the canvas. It'll be on the ground normally. And I won't have an upside or a downside or a left or a right. It will be fairly arbitrary. And that will probably be for 2 or 3 canvases that I'll be working on. And that'll take me, a couple of days to lay out stuff. Again, I'm not editing at all at this stage. And only then, after a week, I would then have a look at the work with a kind of critical eye to see if there's anything in what I've done that seems to suggest or remind me. Again, the hindsight idea that something will pop into my head when I'm looking at the work, thinking, last week when I was up at Glentana or I was Palate or whatever it was I had been, it'll connect with that and it might lead me then for that to become a specific landscape. And then it will become, to some extent, realistic, or realism will enter it. But it will constantly be checked if it becomes too naturalistic and too real, because that's not what I'm trying to achieve. I'm trying to juggle with a realism which is based on something that's fairly abstract and is compositional and driven by composition. Now, the reason for that isn't terribly perverse. It's just that I find it too boring, if you like, for it to be simply illustrative. And I think Francis Bacon said that, he made the point that he wanted to make pictures which gave you the sensation without the boredom of its conveyance. And I think when you see how a painting's been made and it's fairly straightforward, it's already boring. And if you understand it in illustrative terms very quickly, it loses its interest for me. So the idea of playing with figuration, realism, and abstraction within the picture makes it a far more interesting outcome. And as you can see here, I've got things hanging up to dry, I've got things laid out. And this is clearly an early stage that all the pictures go through. So I've obviously got the space in this studio to do that, but I've done it in a more modest way, similar studios that I've had in the past, in terms of, the process.
This is another shot of your studio. It's really interesting hearing about your process, because I think it is quite unusual in a way that development of subject matter at kind of a middle to late stage of the work is fascinating. We've discussed before how chance is a major aspect of your work, and working intuitively and developing as you go is very much central to your practice. These are a couple of shots of work in the show, looking very beautiful. And these are really exemplary of that kind of balance that we've discussed of figuration, abstraction, and the work really in the show is very much engaged in the landscape. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what it is that draws you into these kind of forestscapes and towards water and the river.
It genuinely is a reflection when I'm in the studio of what I've been experiencing. I mean, I'm out and about. I spend most of my time, if I'm not in the studio, out in the outdoors. I've been fortunate in where I've been living in a kind of rural idyll, and there's been lots to look at and lots to see. And I'm very curious about anything, and I go and investigate it. And when I come back to the studio, I see these things emerge in the work that I'm making. And it's not a conscious train, it's much more a discovery. Again, the hindsight idea is I realize what I'm doing when it's kind of almost finished. And you know, is what I do. Going back to the earlier point, I think it's important to have facility and understand design and balance and tone and line and drawing, to know all of these things in order to be able to fine tune things and to get the nuance that you're after, to knock things back tonally, to enliven things. It's constantly this juggling, which I think comes from an academic background, although looking at the work, I don't think it's that obvious that you know, you've got 9 out of 10 for your life drawing. I think it's much more to do with a kind of instinctive, now anyway, realization that that's enough. And I don't really know how I can say that's enough when I'm finishing a piece of work. It seems to strike me that I don't need to do more to it. And I'm the judge, it's not anyone else. I don't do commissioned work in that sense. So it's me who makes that instinctive decision.
And talking about sort of instincts and building work up and reevaluating it, you've worked with collage for a long time and mixed media methods. What draws you to working with collage and kind of adding unusual materials to your work?
Well, I think it's I suppose like a lot of students, I was taken in by a lot of the abstract expressionist work, which, you know, Rauschenberg was doing that, the idea that you could go for a walk and collect stuff and then bring it back to the studio and make some art from it. And that struck me as being, you know, both economic as a student, you could do that kind of thing. And it would, again, throw up ideas which perhaps you wouldn't have come up with had you, you know, simply drawn or use a photograph to copy. So the idea of bringing ready-mades into it is pretty well trodden territory in the 20th century modernism, but it was to continue that, to say, well, I've got this interesting bit of tape or this piece of pattern paper here. I wonder if that would, you know, work in this composition. And quite often they're obliterated after a while. It's not the case that everything that you see in the end was the only things that were in the composition. It's a case of putting things in, trying them out, and then taking them out. Some days you have to go in and be quite radical. And that is the case. Some days you're quite apprehensive and sensitive to small changes, and other days you're far more radical. And you just have to recognize that these are the days for fine tuning are not the radical days.
I think it's a wonderful skill to have, being able to self-edit. I think it's something that it's very difficult, and I think it's a testament to the success of the work of the show that, as you say, hindsight and revision and evaluation is essential to your practice.
Yeah,
it's very clear.
I mean, if you go back to the Black Isle one that you were just looking at there, I mean, I'd never been up to Cromarty, and it was only last year I had gone up to the Black Isle, and I was absolutely amazed that it was just incredible. It's neither an isle nor is it black, a typical Scottish label, but it has the Invergordon, the kind of rigs and so on, which are nestling in this incredible bay, and this beautiful landscape, which is not scarred, but is clearly got these engineering projects going on dotted around. And it had this just a wonderful kind of image for me when I came back to the studio and started to work on a canvas which didn't really have a direction. This emerged. And it couldn't have emerged had I not been up and spent, you know, the week at Cromarty, and that's how it works for me. I seem to absorb wherever I am, and it comes out, you know, in the next week or month when I get the chance to digest and reflect on what I've seen. And I have to be working. That's the thing. I need to be in the studio working. It won't come to me in a vision, as it were, you know, in my head. It really has to come through the process of making. exploring the paint and the surfaces that I'm working with.
It's interesting that considering your engineering background, often although your work is very much, you know, about being ensconced in the landscape, there are still these man-made elements that come through, you know, bridges and paths and even the hammocks. There's always this kind of mark, I guess, of humanity on the land.
Yeah.
Would you say that your work is involved in, or sort of, I guess, obliquely aware of environmental factors?
Yeah, yes, not in a kind of preachy sense, but certainly the idea that the landscape is managed. And I think it's beautiful in that sense that there's an intervention. And I did make paintings in the early 90s for about a decade about kind of permaculture. And, you know, when I came up to Aberdeenshire initially, it was the early stage, I suppose, of all the polytunnels and the forced growths and so on. And I think there are some skeptics wondering whether that's the right thing to be doing with nature, but it seems to me to be natural that we want to, you know, make things better or improve. And so the permaculture and the changes that were going on in the landscape all appealed to me. I think they had been roundly rejected by lots of landscape artists who didn't want to see a caravan in the landscape and didn't want to see a rickety shed, which had been, you know, like a postmodernist architect had put together. These were the things that appealed to me. Mm-hmm. So I incorporated them, and that's I think that's maybe answering to some extent my engineering background. I find great beauty in architecture and engineering and design in that sense. You know, I think it can be a great foil in nature and the balancing that's required.
And I'm sure everybody would be interested to hear also, Frank, how your working methods have or have not been affected over the last year by the pandemic. Have things changed? Has your subject matter changed?
I could answer this in a couple of ways. That it hasn't really changed in as much as that what I've been aware of is other people experiencing what I normally experience and finding it very traumatic. And as much as that they don't see people very often and spend a long time themselves and so on. And that's normal for me. So it's not really been a change in that respect. But I think my awareness of what's going on has become more acute. So I'm less detached from what's happening, and you know, the solitary walks, the importance of walks and getting out and so on have in themselves have become far more important. And this little series was just that. It was the importance of getting out and walking and people interacting, distance slightly, doing what they can. So there was some influence in terms of what I was thinking about, but not a huge difference to my approach and the way that I make work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I should say these are smaller works. That's one of the other things that's come in. I often made smaller works, which I never exhibited. I made them just to get an idea going, to give me some insight into what might make a better, bigger painting. I had always considered the small paintings not to be important, and I've changed my views on that. It's not everyone who's got a big space to hang work either. So you know, I've had many pictures that have come back from exhibition with a note saying if only it had been a bit smaller. So, you know, I do think that that's an important practical feature that I've brought more recently into my practice, and that's working on a smaller scale.
And there's something really rich and jewel-like about the smaller ones. I think obviously your colours and your palette is really vibrant and warm, but when it's kind of distilled into this smaller size, which is not typical of your work necessarily, I think it has a really wonderful richness to it. And as I said at the top, you've just moved house, you've moved to Montrose. Do you think, being in this new place is going to change your work, or are you sort of thinking that, it's just a new place to explore?
I suppose we'll see. I have retained the big studio in Staccato. I still have that. But this new environment, I do tend to embrace things now with the prospect that they'll influence work and they'll change things. And so I'm much more open to how it might affect me. I think I was saying earlier on, that's a factor that I'm aware of now, is that I want to be affected by what's going on around me as opposed to just being detached in the studio. I want things to influence. So I imagine my palette will change. And Montrose is not new to me. I live not 10 miles, 15 miles from here for 20 years, nearly 20 years. So it's not like I've moved to another continent and it's going to have a devastating change. But it is nevertheless, I'm hoping that it'll influence me in a way that it's began to. Even some of the Montrose walks around the basin. For those who don't know, Montrose, it has this incredible basin. I don't know what it must be about 100 acres, which twice a day empties and fills up. And it's the most spectacular thing that could be, and it does it every day, hail, rain, doesn't matter what the weather, time of year, it does it all the time. And it's just an incredible thing. Now that I am sure is going to affect some of my thinking about the landscape. There'll probably be some more water worlds, I suspect.
Yeah, well, we look forward to seeing that work. Very exciting. All right. Thank you so much, Frank. I think I'm going to stop screen sharing and we're going to look at the questions now. Let me just have a look. Okie doke. So, questions from the audience. There's a question here. Do you use mainly oil or acrylic paint in your mixed media work?
Well, it's pretty much split 50-50. I have to say I'm a bit of a stickler for the idea that you can't paint acrylic or water-based on top of oils. You really have to do the other way around. So you're water-based, get that done, and then introduce the oils, as the secondary layer. Now, I'm not always strict with that. Sometimes I err and go back in with water-based, but it usually behaves strangely on top of any oil-based, so it tends not to work. So yes, I think I split it pretty much 50-50. I have the process is that the acrylic obviously dries much more quickly, so I can get big things done fairly quickly and then revise them at length with the oil-based media and collage on top of that.
Thank you. And just to say, if anybody else has questions, please do keep typing them in. Another question here, Frank. You say your ideas are your main armory when you start work. How do you think you would deal with taking on another media, perhaps 3D work or working with moving images? Is there something compelling about the act of paint?
I do think that there's something compelling about the paint. I mean, I dabbled and made wee films and take photographs and so on. I'm not, I'm anything but a hater of technology. I embraced it right way back. I think I was one of the first to have a mobile phone, but of course no one else had one. So I was kind of left with myself in the early 90s, late 80s. So I'm not against technology in other forms. It's simply that there's something about the low-tech nature of painting. It requires nothing. It requires just some paint and some brushes and some surfaces. And it ties me back in historical terms to everybody who's tried to do this thing about making images. So there is something I'm very happy to stick with paint, as opposed to feel the need that I need to go and express it through film. You know, as I say, a collaboration, maybe that would work, but not to, you know, become consumed by that as another form for me.
Thank you. And a question here from Mei Leong from Malaysia, formerly attended Gray's School of Art, so presumably your former students perhaps. He says, thanks for sharing your ideas. She's asking what keeps your palette so vibrant and vivid in your earlier and later works? So I guess a question about colour, really.
Well, it's not, I have no fear, and that could be taken as being naive or a bit daft, but I don't worry about getting it wrong. So I'm prepared to overstate something and tone it down, as opposed to understate and kind of try and get a kick. I'd much prefer to work the other way. So I'm often far bolder in the outset. Now, some pictures turn into complete neutral, not very often, but neutral and very tonal, subtle paintings, but they've started out pretty much as the vibrant ones which you might see hanging next to it. So it is a process for me of overstating and then refining. And I would say that, I mean, don't be afraid of colour. I think it's a case of when you're going to exhibit it, that's different. I think you should have revised it, you should have refined it, you should have thought long and hard about it, because that will become a critical element and it's being viewed. You know, do you know what you're doing with colour? And there's a lot of artists who use colour, but I'm not entirely sure they know what they're doing with the colour. It is entirely arbitrary by the time they've sent it out. Now, as I say, I can only speak for myself, but it does take a lot of time for me to decide that that orange and blue should remain together. And the consequences of that kind of discord are pretty strong. So you can't do that without considering how it's affecting other elements in the painting. You know, it could be a distraction. But these are kind of formal considerations, and I'm not sure that everybody's too interested in that.
It is interesting, I guess, to remember that you have that very formal groundwork to your practice, and although your work is intuitive and informed by chance, you know, you have a very structured basis, I guess, and this field of interesting influences that have made your work what it is. So moving on, another question here. Is quite cerebral. Do you see collage as a fitting metaphor for the patchwork of consciousness that creates inner reality? I'll leave that one with you.
Well, you know, I wouldn't discount anything, and I think the idea of interpreting work is important to me. So someone seeing some connection, a conflation of ideas through the process that they observe in my work is fine by me. It's one of the things which is very important when I'm looking at other artworks, that I can see different levels and enjoy different elements within it. And imagine the considerations that have been made. It doesn't matter if they're accurate. It doesn't matter if they're real. I don't need them confirmed by the artist. So it's quite, I quite like the idea that somebody can take things which I didn't necessarily intend from the work, because that's what I hoped for. I hoped that it would be there would be something about the work that would intrigue and want them to, or make them want to look longer at the work and to consider it and reconsider it. And then to me that you've made a connection then. And as I say, not being too harsh on illustration, it has its job to do. It tells you something and then you move on to the next one and it tells you something and it moves. Now, I'm not interested in that. It's the one image, and I think you need to stay with that image and see it and understand that there are layers to it and the possibilities. Where might this go? What might have happened? Why is this here? And so on. All these questions should come from looking at the work. if you don't have these questions, that the painting for me has failed. And so, you know, I'm the judge of that, and as much as I don't put it out in the world until I've got that kind of feedback from it, and I just hope that others would. So it's maybe a bit convoluted, my answer, but I'm very open to the idea that the work could be a metaphor for many things. That would be very much what the viewer brings to it, which is of interest to me, what they bring to it.
Brilliant. Excellent answer. Just one more, perhaps, before we all go off to get a glass of wine. Do you have a painting hanging in the Usher Hall?
In the Usher Hall?
Yeah.
I'm not. I could have. I'm not sure.
Well, maybe
it's possible. It's possible.
Research into that one. All right. Thank you so much, Frank.